Unbelievable stuff.
All right, speaking about last man standing, what about CNN?
Oh my gosh, last man standing is not Chris Licht. You know, incredible. You know, I'm going to dive into this as a case study because the story isn't just, hey, Chris Licht was there for a year, all these things happened, and now he's gone. That's not the story. This is a story of a company that was in trouble, that needed to do some things, that hired a leader. The leader had a boss. So let's think of him as a division president, which he was, and the leader of the larger organization. There's all these other cable channels, Warner, Discovery, all kinds of things. They own CNN. CNN is just one. Think of it as a division. We're going to go look at this because I've got something to say about this. All kinds of headlines all weekend, right?
It's been all over the place. It's been all over the stage.
Well, guess what? The initial headlines turns out that you're seeing over this weekend are not the whole story. The mainstream media is sticking together, and all the people at CNN are saying, yeah, it was Chris Licht. He was the issue. Well, let me tell you, like the Kennedy assassination, like Russian interference in the 2016 election, like the war in Ukraine, I'm going to show you that the initial headlines not only don't have the whole story, but they're not necessarily all correct. The media was saying that Licht is out and his decisions did this and that, and oh, he lost control of the newsroom, lost the confidence. That may be true, but let's dive into it, okay? Let's step into it. You had people over the weekend, also people over the weekend were saying pretty funny things.
Yep, there's a lot of interesting
Did you see
stuff.
Coulter's tweet?
Coulter's tweet, yeah. And we can see if we can pull it up here, Mr. Reckless, but the tweet was basically saying not many people know that Chris Licht was fired because they announced it on CNN.
Right. Yeah, when the ratings are down, even your own bad news doesn't get out, so maybe that's good.
That's a good thing.
So you have a bunch of people talking about it. So let me step back. Let me start the case study right here. CNN is a business in trouble. I'm going to show you they had a product problem. Maybe your company has had a product problem. Maybe that's been the source of some things. There's product and leadership once you're an existing company. You either lack leadership, maybe it's sales, maybe it's technology, maybe it's whatever it is, or you have a product problem. People aren't buying it anymore. Someone else has a lower price or a better product. That's usually where it starts. CNN had a product problem, and I'm going to show it to you. Because while Chris Licht and some recent things may have been the last straw, and that's why he left the company over the weekend, I'm going to show you that the first straw was really where it started, and that was under the leadership of a guy named Jeff Zucker, who was at CNN, and the product changed dramatically. Let's dive in. So this was a turnaround story. CNN was a turnaround story. Similar to Ford, if you know your history, a guy named Alan Mulally some years ago came back into Ford, became the CEO, really revitalized the product line and the dealer network, and lifted Ford up. Also, during 2008, during that time, during what was called TARP, where a bunch of bailouts happened during the financial crisis, Ford didn't take any money from the government. Alan Mulally said, I think I've got my company part turned around. I'm here for a turnaround. I think we can make it without any of that.
Keep going, yeah. He came from Boeing, if I'm not mistaken.
That's exactly right. He came from Boeing. So it was also a transportation somewhat larger vehicles.
It's somewhat larger and a little bit more complex maybe, but I think it's the same principles.
But he had Ford in a good position. During the financial crisis, he executed the turnaround and didn't even take money during that. That is an example of leadership in a crisis, getting it done. We also have Steve Jobs. People know the story. Steve Jobs came back to Apple, kind of turned Apple around. The iMac, the iPod were some initial steps he took, which led to the iPhone. iPod was a music, player.
iPads.
Back when we called them MP3 players, that became the iPhone. And so Steve Jobs turned Apple around. Apple had a product issue. Ford had a product issue. Ladies and gentlemen, CNN had a product issue. Chris Licht was hired in May of 2022. It was May of 2022.
Yes.
He gets hired. But what happened in February? Let's rewind just into February a little bit, and let's show you what the product looked like when he was brought in by David Zaslav to be the head of CNN. Well, Forbes was reporting that CNN was in the middle of a ratings freefall. Their ratings had collapsed nearly, look at this, 70%. This is Glenn Greenwald, who follows media, actually tweeting about this, and we can see this tweet about the ratings collapse and the statistics that were from Forbes. So this wasn't a gossip column. This wasn't Page 6, as we know in New York, talking about it. This was a business publication covering a business story. This company, CNN, had a product problem and people were no longer watching. They had suffered a 70% drop in ratings. Well, part of that was under Jeff Zucker, and here's what happened. During the Trump administration, Trump was a ratings machine. Why? Because every news media outlet could find something to talk about, something to scream about, something to be upset about,
More
right?
than enough tweets.
And more than enough tweets from Trump, and there's this, and there's this. Suddenly, they would be interrupting themselves, and, Pete Madden is here somewhere, and he'll appreciate this, because it sounded like Connie Chung's honeymoon, this just in, and we've got all these things and tweets that were running around. So you've got everyone on the business side talking about CNN's product problem. That after Trump left the White House, and when Biden came in February of 21, is when he was inaugurated, January, February there, we were in the middle of the COVID crisis. So it was COVID on the news, but there is no more Trump stories. There's a little bit about January 6th and things that were going around, but the main story was COVID. And if you took surveys of the American TV watching consumer, they were getting very fatigued by COVID by this time. They were locked out of jobs. The work from home thing was there. Their kids were locked out of school. And people were getting very impatient and very frustrated by the whole COVID apocalypse of lockdowns. And then Trump's out. So CNN finds itself without this golden goose that was laying tweets every day that were like golden eggs that they could then talk about. And ratings were phenomenal as a center liberal audience on CNN was tuning in. And Zucker was just feeding the beast. But there was nothing being built for after it. And so when Trump is out, Biden is in, and COVID is in full speed, the only thing that CNN had was COVID. And what happened at the beginning of 22? At the beginning of 22, we started to see changes in COVID. It started to calm down. It was mid-year 22 when COVID was suddenly not such an alarming thing, and the statistics were less crazy. And people getting COVID and the variants, they had Omni variant, Delta variant, suddenly the variants weren't so severe, causing deaths the way they had been. And so, by the way, that was the first 90 days of Chris Licht. But let's step back to when he walks in, and let's look at the primetime cable ratings chart that we have that showed the major networks. And let's look at what was going on as Chris Licht walks in the door. Here it is. Q4 2020. You can see the ratings suddenly drop. The surge that you saw from 19 to 2020 was COVID is here, and it was the election campaign, Trump's tweets, him being bombastic. And as soon as the election was over, all we're talking about is COVID, and you can see the ratings drop like a rock. If you're watching at home, the chart shows CNN on a red line, MSNBC on a blue line, dropping below the ratings they had before the election and before COVID. So during the 2016 to 2020 administration of Trump, you can see where their ratings were relatively flat. COVID in the election, they go skyrocketing. Soon as the election is over, they drop like a stone, except Fox goes back to pretty much almost where it was before COVID and before the election. You follow that? Fox manages to stay pretty level in the before and after, but CNN and MSNBC are suddenly lower than they were. Well, guess what? CNN had a product problem. What shows do you have? What news exposés? What interesting coverage do you have for the American viewer to keep them tuned into CNN? Because as Chris Licht is hired, COVID stories are dropping. The American consumer is already fatigued as hell about that. And there's no more Trump except that this January 6th stuff popping up like popcorn. Are we going to indict him? What are we going to do? Ladies and gentlemen, Chris Licht didn't have to do with any of that. Nothing to do with it. He was hired as a showrunner who had done Morning Joe, he had done Stephen Colbert, and he had done CBS This Morning. He was what we call an executive producer and a showrunner. Now he's being asked to run a network and to do it as a turnaround executive. Chris Licht, I've listened to many interviews with him. This is a sharp guy that knows what he's doing. But was he given a job that he was just not going to be able to succeed at no matter what? I happen to think that's the case. I also happen to think that what was going on at CNN, which was only 5% of Warner Discovery, 5% of Warner Discovery. So CNN is 5% of Warner Discovery, but over the course of a year, they were like 80% of the headlines, which is not what David Zaslav wants.
That's not a good look. Not the good headlines, at least.
5% of my company is 80% of my headaches. It's like, that's the one you got to stop. So let's go take a look at what went on in there. So you don't have any Trump stories. You don't have anything that's interesting. You don't have any new programming.
But people aren't really listening to COVID. There's no fear of it anymore or anything like that.
But literally the day before he takes the job, they announced a major project was being canceled. It was basically stillborn. And what was that?
That was Chris Como.
Well, Chris Como was before, but remember they built an online...
that's CNN Plus.
Correct, CNN Plus. CNN Plus will save the world. So they were actually trying to do something. And Zucker was trying to do something. And this is, so they were making an effort. It wasn't sitting around doing nothing, but you get credit for what works, not what doesn't work. Steve Jobs would get credit for things that worked. And now we have iPhones. And unfortunately, Jeff Zucker put all this energy into it, and CNN Plus had all these things lined up. They had... who did they recruit from Fox?
They recruited
mid-tier. He's a moderate guy, Chris Wallace. So they recruit Chris Wallace and all these other people that are going to be on CNN Plus. It goes out the door. No one will subscribe to it. No one is downloading it, and fewer are subscribing. If I have that backwards, no one was downloading, fewer are subscribing. Nope. In the case of CNN Plus, that is correct. And so they cancel it. So Chris Licht is there at the announcement, and he walks in to the aftermath of Chris Como. The aftermath, actually, he walks in waving his arms like this because all the smoke and papers in the air because CNN Plus is just blown up. And he also has a problem child to manage. Yeah, you may also want to check on Don Lemon. Why? Well, there's some things going on with Don.
He was removed.
But you're in charge now, so can you go manage that?
Yeah, it's your problem.
So, yep, there is a problem. So now you got Don Lemon. And Don Lemon was on evening hour. The ratings weren't there. They move him off there. He was a hard guy to deal with, apparently. Production crew and writers were saying, gosh, what a hard guy to work for. He could be such a good journalist. He's so good on camera, but my goodness, he is just a high maintenance guy and this is terrible. And they said, well, his ratings suck, so we're pulling him off the evening. And so suddenly Chris Licht is told, find something to do with him. And so his first 3 months were nothing but the adjustments and a product that nobody wants to watch. So first of all, tell me, how is that Chris Licht's problem? How is it his fault? Answer is, it's not his fault, but it was his problem because he was the guy hired to fix it and he knew it.
And you inherit that crap with it.
Exactly. So we also find out news leaks, literally 30 days or so after Chris Licht started, there was this leak that CNN had paid a research firm toward the end of 21 to find out why its ratings were tanking. And so if I was these researchers, I would have taken the retainer check and disappeared for 6 weeks and say, I'm working on it. I would have been in Barbados, having umbrella drinks. And I would have come back and said, well, you have no new programming and you don't have Trump to kick around anymore. That's a problem with your ratings. And then I would have cashed a check. So they hired this research firm to do this. And so off they go. So they're working on it. And so David Zaslav had that data. So he knew that they had two things on there. Number one, there was a high left-wing bias. Number two, there was high fatigue for COVID. And number three, hey, you canceled that mini-series you've been running for a couple of years called Trump is a bad guy.
Yep.
What a great mini-series. Why'd you cancel it? Well, because we elected a new president. Well, the viewers, that's not what the viewers saw. The viewers saw, wow, there's nothing to see here. So at the time, Zaslav says this: I don't want CNN to be the anti-Trump network, and I want a wider range of political viewpoints. So as Chris walks in, he's greeted by Zaslav that says that. So Chris knows, hey, whatever I do here, I have to widen the viewpoint to be a little bit more moderate. And what Zaslav didn't tell him is the newsroom was packed full of loyalists to Jeff Zucker, who were hard left-leaning.
Yep.
And so that group was already, when Licht walks in, they're feeling organ rejection. And let me tell you what organ rejection is. Organ rejection, when you're running a business and you hire somebody in, and maybe you lost the VP of sales, or you had to let somebody go, and you bring someone in. The new guy, first of all, is your guy. It doesn't belong to the sales department, it doesn't belong to your people. The boss brought in the new guy. And so the first thing you have to do is find a way to win over the hearts of the people that are there, because you're there because the guy they liked or the woman they liked got fired or quit. And so the opportunity for organ rejection is high, meaning no one's going to like this new person no matter what they do. They could walk on water properly. Everybody there is upset about everything that's happened. They're upset at the management, you, and we call it organ rejection, medical term. So CNN was already, Licht didn't come from news, minus number one. He was not hard left, minus number two.
He canceled CNN Plus, minus number three.
He came in when they were canceling CNN Plus, and the guy he hired him, they did it, and they got rid of beloved Zucker. He's David's guy. Licht here is David's guy. So Licht had his work cut out from him in winning over the newsroom. And that was going to be tough walking in. And then he's got to make a decision on Lemon. So there's what he's walking into. And he's not a turnaround specialist. And I don't think he had the instincts of a turnaround specialist. There were some things that he did organizationally. He didn't want to be seen as the guy that took Jeff Zucker's office, so he converted it to a conference room, and he took a different office. He didn't want to be seen as that guy, so he had some sense about that. But people also saw that, oh, you don't want to be down here with the newsroom people? You want to be on a different floor? Oh, that's who you are. That's unfair, and that's not what he was thinking, but nonetheless, organ rejection. Here's all the things that are coming at him.